Really happy to be able to talk to my colleague and friend, Bruce Cain. Bruce is a professor of political science. After spending first part of his career at Berkeley, he came over to Stanford several years ago, and he's now the director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. And he has been working on a book, he's been working on climate issues and climate governance in general, and he's got a book that focuses on the West, on California, and the challenges that we face. We've just gone through a rather peculiar winter, so after several years of drought, we had nonstop atmospheric rivers in the winter of 2022-23, but we still, are facing a crisis in the long run because the environment here in California and the West in general is extremely fragile. So Bruce, maybe you can just start by talking a bit about your book and the kind of major findings of it and what it implies for public policy.
Well, thank you, Frank. This book is about one half of the climate challenge, and that's the adaptation side, which as recently as 5 or 6 years ago was kind of put to the side with the understandable emphasis on mitigation issues, i.e. how do we decarbonize the economy, how do we reduce the amount of greenhouse gas that's going up into the atmosphere. But at the time, I think a lot of people believed that we didn't have to worry about the consequences of what was going on up in the atmosphere quite yet, and that we could put all our energy into the mitigation side. But of course, Mother Nature caught up to us, and now we're seeing more and more instances of extreme weather. So one theme of this is that we now have to balance the considerations about climate adaptation and protecting communities or moving communities much more seriously. And that's going to cut into the money and resources that we were hoping to put into just the decarbonization. So now we have a dual challenge earlier than we thought we would have. The second piece of it is that, we expect that given the nature of the political system for obstruction, when you're dealing with major challenges like this that cross jurisdictional lines, that have partisan consequences, that try to deal with problems that are in the future, or deal with infrastructure which needs to, the benefits of which you can't realize until the thing gets built many years later. Those are kind of always the difficult issues in American politics. But this one is the mother of all problems, because it really has a global public goods problem, that what we do in California, if we try to be more virtuous than the other states, doesn't do us a lot of good if the rest of the world isn't responding, or the rest of the states are. So the number of jurisdictions you have to sort of collaborate with is greater. There are now reactions against this in many different areas of the world. But then, in particular, when you get to the adaptation challenge, and what makes it both interesting and promising is that adaptation is something that we've actually pretty good at when we're in crisis. So if you look at what we've done with natural disasters, political scientists have shown that we're pretty good at providing relief because it coincides with the electoral incentives. That is, every politician wants to solve a problem and provide money.
Right.
But they're not so great about doing the preparation for the problem. There are major challenges with this, but there's also an opportunity here, in the sense that because people recognize the importance of protecting themselves, that if they've been flooded, they don't want to be flooded again. If they've been near a fire, it's a scarring experience in many different ways. Or if they're dealing with this very thick smoke you can get from wildfires, it has terrible health consequences both in the long run and in the short run.
Right.
So all these things open up an opportunity to have some bipartisan consensus potentially between parties, and to get people on the same page. And there is some now growing evidence that happens if indeed you are scarred with those events. So I wanted to see how far that went. I wanted to see what kind of progress we were making when we know and have known certainly in many of the coastal communities and many of the blue states, the reality of climate change has kicked in, but curiously, we're way behind in doing anything about it. So why is it in the very blue areas where you would expect people to understand the importance of doing something, they don't do it? And so I wanted to look at that problem. And lastly, I'd just say that the thing about adaptation, which is fascinating, the reason why a book on the West makes sense, is that the challenges of weather and climate vary with the region. And the western region is distinctively drought prone, has less precipitation, and has to deal with the intermittency of storms, that is too much water and too little water, with forms of storage. And so if we think about what the government did to inhabit the West, which in the early 19th century was seen to be kind of an arid area that we probably weren't going to do much with, and then the government decided in order to protect the borders of the West and to claim the land, we needed to get people there. And so we had to bribe them with the Homestead Act and various other kinds of acts to actually work on the land. But in order to really make the population grow in the early 20th century up through World War II, we really had to provide infrastructure projects. And so there was a defense component to building the infrastructure of water and energy that allowed the West to prosper. But the end of the Cold War and the general Reagan administration push against big government pushed a lot of these responsibilities back down to the states. And states struggle with that. They can't run deficits. And so a number of states have had trouble, especially since the rise of the environmental movement, where you get a lot more pushback against reservoirs and canals and big dams, and the things that made the West habitable now are regarded by many on the left as being environmentally destructive. So then the question is, well, okay, wait a minute, you live in this area that has either feast or famine with water, which means that you have to deal with the intermittency of the weather events with storage, which is infrastructure. And what is the infrastructure if you're not going to build the infrastructure to build up the West? Yeah. So it's a fascinating problem that is more of a problem distinctively around water issues, and then the related fire and mudslide issues that come as a result of the cycle of, well, the vegetation grows, it dries, and then the fires start, and they're getting worse. So the story is a fascinating story, and it is a very Western story. So that was the reason to sort of locate it as climate adaptation in the West.
Yeah. Well, I've had an opportunity to read a draft of the book. You are dealing with the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right, out here in the West. I mean, fire, floods, storms, and the like. And one of the interesting things, it seems to me, is the fact that each of these disasters produces a different political effect. I mean, the impression that it makes on people is different. They last for different periods of time. Maybe you could say a little about that.
No, that exactly. And also the strategies have to adapt. So if we think about the various kinds of extreme weather events, the drought is, on the scale of things, the one that creeps up on you, right? You don't know the first year of the drought that you've got a problem. Somewhere around the third or fourth year, you start to see the reservoir levels are dropping, and then you get into the deeper stages of the drought, and you realize that sources of both electricity in terms of hydropower and sources of water, which you've counted on for decades, are not going to be there. Think of the Colorado River in particular, which is dangerously low. And think of the fights that it will engender between the upper basin and the lower basin if we have to actually make even more severe cuts than we've done already. And so the politics of this is going to get much more zero sum, and we have to figure out a way to meet these challenges. And I think in the West it's hard because we have also a bifurcation between coastal states that are bluer and more oriented towards accepting that we have to do something about climate change, and the interior Western states that for many years depended upon fossil fuels. And so I do think that this is a really important aspect of why the West is a really interesting place to look at the climate adaptation.
So one of the things that political scientists can talk usefully about are institutions and institutional design. And one thing that's quite striking in your analysis is that, well, as you said, the West was built by big government in a certain sense, that put the whole water system in and, took all the water from the Sacramento River Delta and sent it down, down south. Really massive undertaking. But power today is extremely fragmented. And so there's, municipalities, counties, separate specialized districts, and it makes it very difficult to actually have a consistent statewide policy. I mean, California is, after all, a pretty big state, 40 million people, but they managed to fragment authority to an extent that makes it really hard to deal with some of these problems.
Yeah, I think that creates a kind of baseline of inertia. We see in different areas, so if you take, if the drought represents the slow end of things, the fast end of things that gets people's attention are the wildfires. Unfortunately, the fires themselves only, threaten people that are living on the contours of what known as the wildland areas. The smoke, which is very dangerous, permeates everywhere. So how do you get people? Let's think about wildfire management. Okay, well, you got the federal government owns lands, the state government owns lands, and private owners own land. And if one of the neighbors doesn't do its vegetation management, the fires don't respect jurisdictional lines, and the smoke can drift all over the state. So poor Fresno in the middle of the Central Valley gets everybody's smoke, including from Washington and Oregon. So this fracture problem, particularly for something like wildfires, is very great. With drought, it is definitely the same issue. You have many different types of communities, ownerships of the water, utilities, some of them public, some private. But here's the thing, Frank. The reality is that when Governor Brown or you look at other states like New Mexico, when they declare an emergency, people are amazingly responsive. Again, it's back to this irony that when the gun is to our head, we somehow can overcome these things through emergency powers. And so Governor Brown used those emergency powers very effectively. People complied with.
So he declared a drought emergency,
exactly.
And that suspended litigation and other things that were slowing down the ability to respond.
Exactly. So it gives you. It's a contingent. It's an interesting thing about democracy that we didn't spend as much time in except in war powers, but now we're realizing that these emergency powers may actually be used domestically for these weather events, and it does raise some questions about accountability because it has to be a contingent. We've seen this with war powers. If you just give the power and you don't check back and renew it, then it can be an excuse for abuse. So I do think that's an issue. But nonetheless, if you look at the way we've handled droughts, you would say that's an example where when the gun is to our head, and the drought is really bad, or in the wildfire situation, you can get people to unite together. But the problem is that it's episodic. So when you take episodic weather and you combine it with a political system that suffers from ADD, attention deficit disorder, you put these two things together, and it means often, as with ADD personalities, it works well when there's a crisis, but it doesn't work well when people get to relax. And that's the problem, is that we don't do the things that we need to do in the intervals between the crises. We need the crisis in the case of the wildfire, or in the case of a drought, we have to wait 6 or 7 years until the water levels get so low before we actually do anything.
I wonder whether we're going to get to a point with global warming where the effects will be so obvious and kind of continuous that you're going to want something like permanent emergency powers, an oxymoron, right? I mean, can you imagine a set of rules that would actually centralize power and give the governor more authority that actually would still stay within the, the boundaries of what's acceptable in a democracy that tries to check power?
I think it's a challenge, to be honest, because I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that, if not continuous, certainly very, very frequent events could lead to, as you say, unchecked power in areas. And as long as somebody, if the governor or the president has good intentions, that's fine. But we've already seen where, the Republican Party toyed with the idea of not giving aid to New York after Sandy as a kind of retaliation and a punishment. So you could see that kind of abuse, favoritism of some sort, or political retribution. You could see potentially people who want to have an anti-environmental agenda, run roughshod over things that are really important for water quality or safety whatsoever. So I do think that the challenge for us is to think about renewal of emergency powers and review of emergency powers to bring back the checks and balances so that they're used when there is a fairly high level of consensus that they must be used, to solve these problems.
Yeah.
But I also think that if we could do more in the way of preparing for these things so that we soften the blow of these events, we could get communities out of the way, that would also, reduce some of the pressure to sort of centralize power as well. But again, that we haven't been very successful with that.
I once debated a Norwegian professor that, spent a long time praising China and saying that we actually needed to junk our entire democratic system in favor of Chinese authoritarianism. This was wrong on many, many different levels, but it does, this kind of inability to deal with problems does lead people to kind of extreme solutions that in the end are really not, I think what the doctor ordered.
Yeah, I mean, look how long it took New York to put in its new subway line, and you look at the infrastructure and the dams that they built in China, or you think of the progress they've made on electric cars. And I think when you look at it, different types of democracy and then different types of non-democracies all have their relative strengths and weaknesses. No political scientist has been able to find the perfect form of government. And I think there are some things that the Chinese government does better. Although when you look more carefully at, how they're going about things, there's, particularly on the issue of adaptation, there's more decentralization and an understanding that you have to have a variety. They have competitions that allow cities to compete to actually try to do innovative solutions. So there isn't quite as much of a contrast as one might think when you look under the hood of these things. And after all, they did, in response to terrible pollution in Beijing, they really did enforce environmental regulations much more carefully in recent years as a result of a party conference meeting. One of my students did a dissertation on this, and there are definite examples in which even authoritarian government has to pay attention to the health of weather, particularly if wealthy people and powerful people are also experiencing the same problems. But I do think that the advantage of the American system, because let's be balanced about this, you and I can go on forever about the disadvantages and the vetocracy and all that, and I completely agree with all of that and stuff you've written about it. But there are a couple things that we do very well. One is we do sometimes actually use states as laboratories to be first movers.
Right.
And you can see that in the climate and environmental realm, that when California decided that it would go after tailpipe emissions, the market had to follow, and pretty soon it expanded. Okay, so and that points to the second thing, is that we really are better at working with the private sector and leveraging private money. Even the universities, if you think about it, the French and the European universities don't get private money the way we do to do the research, and so their students come here to study. The tax laws that we have that take advantage of the high inequality we have to sort of get people to contribute either by setting up foundations or contribute to research projects, does at least create more of a creative culture and an innovative, higher rate of innovation with respect to technology. So I think we have to recognize that maybe we have a role. The Europeans are better at sort of implementing a lot of the mitigation and decarbonization measures, but it's created over there. I think it's contributed to this whole democracy deficit problem that the EU has, that there is this perception that bureaucrats are not responsive or are allowed to make these choices. But on the other hand, they have made much more progress than we have in many areas. Here, I think we've done, our role may be the innovator of things, the trying out of things. But the downside is that I think in terms of public response, we'll probably lag behind the Europeans and certainly the Chinese.
So let me change gears a little bit. Back in 2014, Bob Cohane wrote an article about, how political scientists ought to engage with the climate issue, and he felt that there really wasn't enough attention paid because ultimately, the obstacles, there's obviously scientific, engineering challenges, certainly, economic challenges, but it's really, fundamentally a political economy question, right? That you have to make decisions, they're painful, you have to figure out how to allocate the pain, or in some cases, if you're subsidizing, how to allocate the subsidies and, figure out how to pay for them. Where do you think political science could actually be most helpful in this? I mean, for example, you were focusing on adaptation. Cohane in that article says, yes, political scientists can say a lot about that. How do you implement things? Less so on the mitigation side, because it's kind of a wicked problem that runs directly into these very bad incentives. But, where should we be doing more work to try to solve some of these problems?
Yeah, I mean, the safe thing that I think people do is to sort of just report on the problems and point out, as we've been doing in the discussion, that there are weaknesses in the way the political system operates that creates this inertial force that holds back progress. I think the harder thing that makes people hesitate in political science is to actually propose solutions and work on solutions. And I don't think the answer is for political scientists to go in their room and think about it independently. I think there you really have to engage with the agencies, engage with the people, and do a dialogue. Okay, what are you seeing on the ground, and what do you want to know about the effectiveness of different things? And so I would like to see us do a lot more and say in being involved in, not exclusively doing, but being involved in what's your strategy of outreach, what's your strategy of adaptation, how are you going to go about making these decisions about gas lines or gas stoves or distributed energy or water resources, et cetera. How are you making these decisions? And then when you think you've got a solution, how are you testing with evidence that this is the best way to go? And I think one turn in political science that's happened as we've been political scientists is the much more fussiness about measurement, some of which is maybe excessive. But I like the fact that we're back to trying to measure the impact of things and then feed that back into the system. But again, I don't think it should be political science acting by itself. I think we have to engage. I think public policy's done a better job of that. Medicine does a better job of that. I think we have to engage with the people that are on the front lines and actually work with them to solve those problems.
Yeah, there's a lot of institutional design issues that in other contexts you've written about. I mean, one thing that in a way makes decision-making in a democracy difficult is the demand for participation, public participation. And that sometimes has very unanticipated consequences. It's very hard to find anybody that's a critic of more participation, except for maybe
yours truly. Yes.
Yeah. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I mean, why?
Yeah, no, it's actually central to the solutions part, because let's take permitting, for example. Permitting is an absolutely critical issue because we don't want to lose the environmental protections and safety protections that we've built up over the last 50 or 75 years in particular. But at the same time, they're getting away of greater harm which could come from not acting on the climate change issues. Now, to some extent, I think we could summarize the problem of public participation in this is that it's selection bias. Okay, the dream was that your average citizen would mobilize; it would all be representative feedback, and the reality is anything but that. That John Q. Citizen has other things to do, and will only show up when it directly impacts their neighborhood or their life. And as a consequence, the interest groups or the activists that have a particular perspective or who benefit from this, the commercial interests that benefit it, are just more likely to show up to all these public hearings and give testimony. I've subscribed to all of the hearings up in Sacramento, which I regret on a daily basis when I see 30 emails. But I learn a lot. I don't read them all through, but I learn at the topics. I learn who's actually at the table. And of course, it's exactly, the interest groups. They pay people to monitor these hearings, to show up, to write these letters. Some of it is very useful feedback. I don't want to say that we want to cut this back, because I think the agencies get good feedback, but they're getting a perspective as well. And then there's the people that aren't at the table. And in both permitting and in grantsmanship. So you look at the IRA, this whole question of
Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a lot of credits and loans, etc. If you're not at the table, and if you don't have the capacity to follow the issues, you're not only not going to be there for the regulatory piece, but you're not going to be there to get the contracts. And so these capacity issues are going to multiply. It's going to be the Palo Altos, it's going to be the LAs, the big cities that have the staff that can apply for all these grants and apply for all these subsidies and tax credits and things like that. But you take the communities that are just struggling to get along and are dealing with many different other issues, they're not going to be applying for these things. So I think the problem of selection bias is also coincides with the capacity problems that we have, that some portions of the population are not going to be driving cars, not going to have rooftop solar because they can barely pay for the mortgages, and the people that can are going to get the tax credits and going to get the benefits of the reduced payment. And so this is a huge issue right now in Sacramento about, we need the upper middle class to try out all these things, but we can't leave a whole segment of the population behind, because it's not just about the unjustness of who's paying for what, but it's also that you're not going to get to net zero. You're not going to get to these goals unless you expand all these actions down the socioeconomic ladder. And so it really has to do with scaling as much as justice in the long run. And right now, I think we're struggling with that issue in California. And I think the fact that we're struggling with it on the frontier, I think means that how we resolve these things could be very influential for the rest of the country. And thinking about, you can't just give all these tax benefits to the upper middle class. We've got to figure out, even though we want them to buy all these things and they want them to buy the Teslas, we got to make sure that the market expands for something other than the Teslas, and that used cars are available, and that mass transit gets electrified, and that, and the battery systems should be provided to people in apartments and not just people in homes that can afford the Tesla home battery, stuff like that. We can't postpone that discussion for 20 years from now, or we're just going to not scale on the rate.
And then there's other phenomena that we talked about a little bit in the California 100 study that we both participated. Well, actually, you're the one that got me involved in it. But the decline of local media has also meant that rural areas and small towns that used to have a local newspaper that could keep track of some of these complex issues, that could, report on what was going on in Sacramento, they've all been wiped out by the centralization of media, by the big platforms, big internet platforms. And then you have the steady nationalization of local politics. And so the kinds of acute polarization that exists in Washington has now begun to infect local communities and make it harder for them to work some of these problems out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are two elements of this. One is, and I think that we've seen some progress on this, is making sure that people get internet coverage so that they can get, in rural areas, can get the healthcare coverage, or they can get the schooling, or they can get the expertise that they need. But the downside of that is that, when people could get on Facebook, they were getting, fake news and polarized news. And I think that whole social media is, it affects climate change, but it's much broader than that.
Yeah.
And really, you and I have seen a vast transformation in the gatekeepers of many of our institutions. And that had its pluses and it had its minuses. Now we're getting a lot more kind of plebiscitary influence. And for as long as people have been studying democracies, we've understood that the plebiscitary impulse can be very destructive if it's not filtered in some way. And we thought we had it with representative democracy in the United States. We thought, well, we've nailed this one, and we are a representative that democracy that everybody should copy. And of course, we've discovered that no, we didn't really solve all these problems. And certainly the social media aspect of this, along with direct democracy and various other things, has really transformed politics and made it hard for leaders to really lead and to be able to filter out what has been vetted and what is merely rumor or driven by either profit or political motive. And I think we're a long way from understanding that. I mean, all the fights now about who can be excluded and whether private companies are the ones that should be adjudicating what speech is permissible and not is, as far as I can tell, an unresolved problem.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of frontier issues in democratic practice and theory that really haven't been addressed. I would have to say that in your career, you're one of the few that's really taken on some of these issues directly. So I think you've done a great service for the rest of us. So, okay, well, Bruce, thanks very much.
Thank you, Frank.
This was very informative, and it's something we're going to continue to debate and work at. So hopefully this won't be our last conversation about this.
Thank you very much.
All right, very good. Thanks.